Hi everyone, in this tutorial I'm going to show you how to draw deer antlers in graphite. Now the tips and techniques that I'm sharing in this video can be applied to any kind of antler or horn, so a Highland cow for example would be the same technique. Now what I'm using here is a small paper blending stump and I'm applying graphite powder just to get a base foundation in place. Now I'm purely focusing on where my lights and my darks are. Now the real important thing about this stage is to notice the lightest highlights and actually whether or not they are truly white. Now in most cases there is never going to be a highlight that's bright white unless it's the reflection in the eye or if that reference photo has portions that are overexposed. So in this situation I did want to make sure that I had even the lightest layer of graphite powder over my brighter highlights. Now of course I can pull my erasers back over the top to put in more of my highlights, but it's about understanding whether or not that value that we're working on is as white as the paper. So the next stage in the layering process is actually to use my graphite pencils and put in more of my midtones. I'm looking to build up my values gradually because I feel this is the best way to achieve more depth. Now when I'm working with anything, it doesn't matter if it's fur, feathers, antlers, whatever it may be, I do like to make sure to focus on my contrast. Now contrast is something that I talk about in every single one of my videos, and this is about getting the balance right versus the shadows and the highlights. We need to be making sure that those darker values are as dark as they need to be and that those highlights are as bright as they need to be. Now I do personally prefer to pull in my highlights like I am now on top of my darker layers. Now the reason for that is I feel that the highlights are sitting on top of those darker values, almost like that light is catching the top surface of whatever it is that I'm drawing. So I like to put in those highlights on top of my darker layers. Now of course there are some situations where those values are really bright. Let's say for example the photo is overexposed and I quite like that effect. Then if those highlights are bright, I'll allow the white of the paper to show through and then I can darken it up later if I need to. But that's a really good way of making sure that your highlights are as bright as they need to be, because of course we can't go brighter than the white of the paper. So onto the other antler, and this is a very similar layering process. I'm starting off with my graphite powder and then I'll go back in with my pencils. Now the one thing here that's really important is we now need to be studying the reference photo and drawing what is further away first and building up from there. Now because the elements are behind something and we draw that first, it's going to help bring that depth to the piece. So if we were to draw something that is behind later on, then we're going to potentially make that on the same level as the elements that are in front. So I like to look at a reference photo and work out exactly what is behind and what's in front, just to help maximise the depth. Now other than that, it also helps to break up that reference photo in more manageable chunks. If we're trying to draw everything all at the same time, it can get a little confusing, so I like to be making sure that I'm simplifying that process as much as possible. Now this lower part of the antler is a prime example. There's actually going to be some lighter hairs on the top of the ear that we need to overlap at the end of the video. But I need to be making sure that I'm drawing the antler in first because that is behind the ear. It's in contact at the back. So I want to be making sure that I have captured that impression. Now my biggest tip at this base layer stage is you'll see that I'm moving my blending stump also following the curves of the lights and the darks. This also helps to maximise more of that depth. But not only that, when I come in with my graphite pencils, I'm already having that indication of where I need to move my pencils. So moving the paper blending stump or the eye makeup applicator, whatever is your preference, in the way that that direction, whether or not it's fur, feathers or just the plain smoother highlights and shadows like this, it does make it a lot easier to follow that reference photo. Now as you can see, this very much is a layering process, and I have spoken about contrast already in this video, but contrast can't be achieved just with one or two layers. We do have to build up those layers and work with those values in order to achieve that three-dimensional look. So in most situations, I'll work anywhere from 10 to 15 layers, depending on what it is that I'm drawing. Now in some cases, you could even add more layers than that. As long as the paper allows for those techniques, it's really endless with what you can do. I want to be making sure that I'm not applying too much pressure to those pencils because you don't want to burnish. Now burnishing is where you flatten the tooth of the paper, which will make it more difficult to add more layers as you work. So that is something to pay attention to during that layering process. Now I've spoken a lot about values in this video, but the placement of the highlights and shadows is also really important. As you can see here, when I continue to work with my graphite pencils, I'm reinforcing the darker shadow that's on the lower side of this antler. Whereas the antler that I started with, the darker values are on the lower right hand side. So this is going to vary depending on the light source, but you may also have highlights in areas where you won't necessarily anticipate. Now that could be due to bounce light. So for example, if there was a bright highlight on the top of an ear, that light could therefore bounce onto the back of the antler. So it's something that is going to adjust that lighting, but you do want to study that reference photo closely. Now the other thing regarding drawing antlers or any smoother surface like this is it's not actually smooth like glass. There are going to be little scratches, little notches that are all over this surface. Now the techniques that I'm also using here would be the same when drawing bird beaks. So for example, the parrot, where they've got those scratches on the surface of the beak, you could use the same layering process here. But I want to be making sure that I'm capturing any of those darker lines, those lighter highlights, because that's going to help build up more of that texture that's within the surface of that antler. Now that being said, the softening techniques are also important. I'm only using my graphite pencils at the moment, but I'm using the variation in pressure to create a softness within my values. What this is doing is making sure that those darker scratches on the surface of the antler are not too harsh. Now if you do have a significant indent in that antler, then you're more likely to have those harsher start and stop points. But here it was a little bit more of that smoother appearance. So I want to be making sure that I'm capturing that. Now of course you can use your paper blending stump, your eye makeup applicator, your brushes, whatever your preference is for your blending or softening tools. But in some situations you can actually overblend your details. So this is where I like to use the pencils and adjusting that pressure to capture that smoothness or softness that I'm trying to replicate in that one area. Now this is why graphite is such a versatile medium, and it actually teaches us a lot about colour-based mediums. Now regarding colour mediums, one of the most common questions that I'm asked is how do we know what pencils to use, what colours to select? Now if colour selection was what made a portrait look realistic, then graphite wouldn't look photorealistic at all. But that's far from it. Some of the best hyper-realistic work is achieved with graphite, and there's no drop of colour at all. It's all about contrast and values. Now if we're using graphite here and getting confident with what values to use, those lights and darks, that does transfer across to our colour-based mediums. So it makes colour selection process far easier. Now at this stage of the drawing, before I wanted to move on to the rest of this, I ended up adding in the lighter details on the top of the ear. These final details make a huge difference. So I really do hope that this video has been useful. If it was, I'd be very grateful if you could give it a like and a thumbs up because it makes a huge difference to my channel. I also upload a couple of videos to YouTube every week, so if you would like to get notified of that content, then don't forget to hit the subscribe and the bell button. If you are interested in drawing along to this real-time tutorial or any of my other step-by-step lessons, then I'll link all the information to that in the description below. If you've got any art-related questions, feel free to pop them in the comments. I'm more than happy to help if I can. And I'm going to be uploading another video next week, but as always, thank you so much for watching.